54 years, that's how long the United States and Russia have operated under nuclear arms control agreements. 54 years of limits, inspections, transparency, and at least some guardrails to prevent an unrestricted nuclear arms race. And as of today, February 6th, 2026, those guardrails are gone. The New START Treaty, the last remaining nuclear pact between the world's two largest nuclear powers, has officially expired. For the first time since 1972, there are no caps on American or Russian nuclear arsenals, no limits on how many warheads they can deploy, no inspections to verify compliance, no transparency mechanisms, nothing. And while Trump says he wants a better deal, one that includes China, there are no negotiations underway, no meetings scheduled, no framework being discussed, just silence. And the UN Secretary General is calling this a grave moment for international security. Let's get into the details in today's video. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for being here. Please make sure that you are subscribed to Solando Opinion on YouTube and follow us on social media for more exclusive content. I would absolutely love to see you there. Links are in the video description below to get connected. Let me set the scene for you. It's Thursday morning, February 6th, 2026. In Moscow, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov tells reporters that Russia views this negatively and regrets the treaty's expiration. In Washington, President Trump posts on Truth Social that the New START treaty was a badly negotiated deal, and that instead of extending it, his nuclear experts should work on a new, improved, and modernized treaty. In Beijing, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian says China regrets the expiration and urges the U.S. to resume talks with Russia. But he also makes clear that China will not participate in any trilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. So we have three nuclear superpowers, all expressing concern, none of them actually doing anything to prevent what comes next, an unconstrained three-way nuclear arms race. Let's talk about what we just lost. The New START Treaty was signed in 2010 by President Barack Obama and Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. It went into effect in February 2011 and was designed to last 15 years with an option to extend for another 5. The treaty did three critical things. First, it capped the number of deployed nuclear warheads at 1,550 for each side. Second, it limited the number of deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers to 700 for each country. And third, it established comprehensive inspection and verification mechanisms. U.S. and Russian officials could conduct up to 18 on-site inspections per year at each other's nuclear facilities. They exchanged detailed data twice a year on the number, location, and technical characteristics of their strategic weapons. And they notified each other in advance of any missile tests or movements of nuclear-capable systems. This wasn't just paperwork. This was how both sides knew what the other was doing. Without these inspections and notifications, each country has to guess. And when you're guessing about nuclear weapons, you tend to assume the worst. That leads to overbuilding. That leads to miscalculation. And that leads to an arms race. Now all of that is gone. The treaty expired at midnight, and there's no replacement. Here's where it gets even more concerning. The U.S. and Russia together possess nearly 90% of all nuclear weapons on Earth. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, as of 2025, Russia had approximately 5,580 nuclear warheads. The United States had 5,225. That's a combined total of more than 10,800 warheads. To put that in perspective, these weapons, if used, could destroy all life on the planet multiple times over. And now there are no legal restrictions on how many more they can build. But wait, there's more. China currently has around 600 nuclear warheads. That's far fewer than the US or Russia. But China has been expanding its nuclear arsenal faster than any other country in the world. According to Pentagon assessments, China is adding approximately 100 new warheads every year. By 2035, China is expected to have 1,500 warheads. That's a 150% increase in less than a decade. So not only are the US and Russia unconstrained, but China is rapidly closing the gap. And the Trump administration says any new arms control deal must include China. There's just one problem. China refuses to participate. Lin Jian, China's foreign ministry spokesperson, was very clear on this. He said, and I quote, "China's nuclear forces are not at all on the same scale as those of the US and Russia, and thus China will not participate in nuclear disarmament negotiations at the current stage." Translation: China is not going to agree to limit its arsenal while it's still building up. Why would they? They're trying to catch up to the US and Russia. From Beijing's perspective, asking them to freeze their arsenal at 600 warheads, while the US and Russia each have more than 5,000 makes no sense. So Trump's demand for a trilateral deal is a non-starter, and that means there's no path forward. Now let's talk about how we got here. In February 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia was suspending its participation in the New START treaty. He said Russia couldn't allow U.S. inspectors to visit its nuclear sites at a time when Washington and NATO were openly supporting Ukraine and calling for Russia's defeat in the war. But Putin also emphasized that Russia wasn't withdrawing from the treaty altogether. Moscow pledged to continue respecting the caps on nuclear weapons, and inspections had already been paused since 2020 due to COVID-19 anyway. So the suspension didn't immediately change much. But then, in September 2025, Putin made an offer. He said Russia would voluntarily continue to abide by the treaty's limits for another year if the United States did the same. This would buy time for both sides to negotiate a successor agreement. Trump said at the time that Putin's offer was a good idea, but then Trump didn't respond. Weeks went by, then months. Putin's offer sat unanswered. And on Wednesday, February 5th, just one day before the treaty expired, Russian officials publicly complained that the U.S. had never given an official response. A Russian Foreign Ministry statement said, and I quote, "In fact, it means that our ideas have been deliberately left unanswered. This approach seems erroneous and regrettable." So why didn't Trump respond? Because Trump doesn't want to extend New START. He wants a new deal, a bigger deal, one that includes China. And in Trump's view, agreeing to a one-year extension would let Putin and Xi Jinping off the hook. It would give them breathing room without forcing China to the negotiating table. So Trump gambled. He bet that the threat of an arms race would pressure China into making concessions. But that gamble hasn't paid off. China still refuses to negotiate. And now, the treaty is dead. On Thursday morning, Trump posted on Truth Social defending his decision. He wrote, "Rather than extend New START, a badly negotiated deal by the United States that, aside from everything else, is being grossly violated, we should have our nuclear experts work on a new, improved, and modernized treaty that can last long into the future." Trump didn't specify how Russia was violating the treaty. U.S. intelligence assessments have consistently said that Russia was in compliance with the warhead limits, even after suspending participation. But Trump clearly views the treaty as flawed, and he's not interested in preserving it. Secretary of State Marco Rubio echoed this position on Wednesday. He said, and I quote, "The president's been clear in the past that in order to have true arms control in the 21st century, it's impossible to do something that doesn't include China because of their vast and rapidly growing stockpile." That sounds reasonable on the surface, but the problem is that China isn't playing ball, and without China, there's no deal. So we're stuck. Now let's talk about what happens next. Former officials and arms control experts are sounding the alarm. Christine Wormuth, president of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and a former secretary of the Army, said, and I quote, "There are no more guardrails on the sizes of the United States and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals. That has not been the case for decades." She warned that the U.S. could end up in an unconstrained nuclear arms race with both Russia and China simultaneously. And she pointed out that such a buildup would be extremely expensive at a time when the U.S. national debt is already enormous. Daryl Kimball, executive director of the Arms Control Association, was even more blunt. He said, "If the Trump administration continues to stiff-arm nuclear arms control diplomacy with Russia and decides to increase the number of nuclear weapons in the U.S. deployed strategic arsenal, it will only lead Russia to follow suit and encourage China to accelerate its ongoing strategic buildup in an attempt to maintain a strategic nuclear retaliatory strike capability vis-a-vis the United States. Such a scenario could lead to a years-long, dangerous three-way nuclear arms buildup." Think about that for a second. A three-way nuclear arms race. The U.S. building more warheads to counter Russia and China. Russia building more to keep pace with the U.S. China building more to close the gap with both. And none of them trusting each other because there are no inspections or transparency measures. This is exactly the kind of spiraling competition that arms control treaties were designed to prevent. And it's exactly what we're about to get. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a statement calling this a grave moment for international security. He said, "For the first time in more than half a century, we face a world without any binding limits on the strategic nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States." Former President Barack Obama also weighed in, posting on social media that allowing the treaty to expire would pointlessly wipe out decades of diplomacy and could spark another arms race that makes the world less safe. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Without the treaty, both sides will start planning for worst-case scenarios. U.S. defense planners will assume Russia is building up its arsenal. Russian defense planners will assume the U.S. is doing the same, and both will factor in China's rapid expansion. That means all three countries will likely conclude they need more weapons, more intercontinental ballistic missiles, more submarine-launched missiles, more strategic bombers, more warheads, and the cycle continues. This isn't speculation. This is how arms races work. During the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union engaged in exactly this kind of competition. At its peak in the 1980s, the two superpowers had a combined total of more than 60,000 nuclear warheads. Thousands of them were on hair trigger alert, ready to launch within minutes. The world came terrifyingly close to nuclear war multiple times. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the false alarm incident in 1983 when Soviet systems mistakenly detected incoming US missiles. These weren't hypothetical risks. These were moments when human civilization almost ended because of miscalculation and mistrust. It took decades of painstaking diplomacy to bring those arsenals down. The SALT-I Treaty in 1972, SALT-II in 1979, the INF Treaty in 1987, START-Y in 1991, START-II in 1993, SWORD in 2002, New START in 2010. Each of these agreements represented hard-won compromises between adversaries who didn't trust each other, but recognized that unlimited nuclear competition was insane. And now, in one decision, Trump has thrown all of that away. And let's be clear about the costs. Building nuclear weapons is expensive. Maintaining them is expensive. Modernizing them is extremely expensive. The U.S. is already spending hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 30 years to upgrade its nuclear arsenal. If the U.S. decides it needs even more weapons to counter Russia and China, those costs will skyrocket. Wormuth estimated it could cost trillions, and that money comes from somewhere. It means less funding for other priorities, less for infrastructure, less for education, less for healthcare, more debt. Russia faces the same problem. Its economy is already under enormous strain from sanctions and the war in Ukraine. An arms race with the U.S. and China would drain resources Russia doesn't have. But Putin will do it anyway because he can't afford to look weak. And China is in the strongest position of the three. Its economy is larger and growing faster than Russia's. It can sustain a buildup more easily, but even China will feel the pressure, and all three countries will be locked into a competition that makes everyone less safe and wastes trillions of dollars. There's also the question of other countries. If the US, Russia, and China are all expanding their arsenals, what message does that send to everyone else? India and Pakistan already have nuclear weapons. North Korea is expanding its program. Iran is enriching uranium and could build a bomb if it chooses. If the major powers are building up, why wouldn't smaller countries do the same? The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has prevented the spread of nuclear weapons for decades, becomes harder to enforce when the biggest nuclear powers aren't limiting their own arsenals. And then there's the accident risk. More weapons means more chances for something to go wrong. A technical malfunction, a false alarm, a miscommunication during a crisis. Without the transparency mechanisms that New START provided, the risk of catastrophic miscalculation goes up. Nikolai Sokov, a former Soviet and Russian arms control negotiator who worked on these issues for 45 years, told reporters this week that the treaty's expiration feels like a personal loss. He said the world is now facing a situation where each side had preconceptions and assumptions about what the other side was doing, some of which was faulty and which led to expensive competitions. So where does this leave us? Trump says he wants a new treaty. But he hasn't started negotiations. He hasn't appointed envoys to begin talks. He hasn't laid out a framework for what a new deal would look like. He's just said that China needs to be involved, and China has said no. Russia says it's open to dialogue but hasn't received any official proposal from Washington. So we're in limbo. And while we're in limbo, all three countries can build as many nuclear weapons as they want. The Trump administration insists that this pressure will eventually force China to the table. A senior administration official told reporters, President Trump has spoken repeatedly of addressing the threat nuclear weapons pose to the world and indicated that he would like to keep limits on nuclear weapons and involve China in arms control talks. But there's no timeline for when those talks might begin. And in the meantime, the arms race is already starting. Both the U.S. and Russia are modernizing their nuclear forces. The U.S. is replacing its aging Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles with a new system called Sentinel. It's building a new class of nuclear submarines. It's upgrading its B-21 bomber fleet. Russia is deploying new Sarmat heavy missiles. It's building new strategic submarines. It's developing hypersonic weapons that can evade missile defenses. And China is constructing hundreds of new missile silos in its western deserts. Satellite images show vast construction projects designed to house mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. All three countries are investing heavily in next-generation nuclear technology, and now there's nothing stopping them from deploying as many of these systems as they want. Stay tuned. I will keep you updated as this story develops. We're entering a new era of nuclear competition, one without the safety nets that kept the world relatively stable for more than half a century. Trump has gambled that the threat of an arms race will force China to negotiate. But if that gamble fails, we'll be left with a world where three nuclear superpowers are building up their arsenals with no limits, no inspections, and no trust. And that's a recipe for disaster. This is a story about power, about miscalculation, and about whether leaders understand the stakes when they're playing with weapons that can end civilization. And it's far from over. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this video was informative. Please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with others who might find it interesting. I appreciate every single one of you who watches and engages with this content. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.